Okay, well it is now 3 p.m., so I am going to turn it over to our first presenter. I want to thank you again for joining us today for this session. We are excited to have so many participants, and it's with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Dana Ansel, who will kick off today's workshop. Have a wonderful session, Dana.
Great, thanks Ashley. And welcome everybody to today's workshop. My name is Dana Ansel. And let's start and just look at our poll results. So we have a variety of people from different experience, with different levels of experience and different roles joining today. About 40% are representatives from a higher education institution, and we also have some graduate students, some people from nonprofits, people from RELs and school and district administrators, and also some independent researchers. And in terms of your experience, there's also a wide range. While there's some beginners, there are a lot of people here in today's workshop who have a lot of experience as well. So let's get the presentation started. This is the first session in a series called Learning Together, Translating Research to Practice. We're excited for today's discussion about presenting your findings to maximize impact. As Ashley said, please don't be shy. We want an interactive and rich conversation, and there's clearly a lot of expertise in the audience today, and we would love for you to share your ideas and strategies about how to present research findings. So this workshop series grows out of a large quantity of work that documents the disconnect between education researchers and practitioners and other stakeholders who might use that research. Despite the growth in the number of researcher-practitioner collaborations, gaps in knowledge remain about how to translate research into action effectively. And as a result, education practitioners still make limited direct use of education research findings to drive their decision-making. There have been calls for researchers to better understand how practitioners engage with research, including developing stronger communication skills. At the same time, there are some promising signs. A recent survey of state and district leaders by the National Center for Research and Policy and Practice found that leaders endorse the idea that research can be useful for practice. This series is intended to address some of these challenges. In this session, we'll be focusing on the communication of research findings to audiences who are not primarily researchers. And we hope that by the end of today's session, you might think differently about your communication strategies for different audiences. So here are the goals for today's workshop. Participants will think critically about the needs of different audiences, develop a clear and compelling storyline of the research findings, and create a culture of co-exploration with practitioners as a part of a collaborative process. So depending on your level of experience, you're likely familiar and probably do some of the things we'll be talking about today. What we hope to offer you is a structured process to lead you through these steps in a systematic way. And just to be clear, the focus of today's workshop is on presenting research that has already been completed. The audience may or may not know about the research going into the presentation. This is not a workshop about building or developing researcher-practitioner partnerships. The focus is on presenting completed research to an audience in ways that make the research accessible, relevant, and actionable. So our agenda for today follows these goals. After the sections about considering the audience, developing a compelling storyline, and creating a culture of co-exploration and meaning-making, we will introduce two people, a researcher and practitioner partner, who will discuss the ways that they've worked together to communicate research findings to different audiences. As I mentioned, my name is Dana Ansel, and I'm a researcher at REL Northeast in the Islands. I've worked for many years as a translator of research to policymakers and to the broader public. I'm joined by my two colleagues, Candice Bocala Candice is also a researcher for REL Northeast and the Islands, and she convenes one of the research practice partnerships that's focused on professional development in the region. And we're also joined by Jill Marcus. Jill is a former classroom teacher and school administrator who has worked on numerous education research projects. And later we'll introduce Claire Irwin and Wendy Geller for the spotlight part of the agenda to talk about their work together in Vermont. So you should have received a link to the workshop materials, and hopefully you were able to print them and you have them handy. And if not, you can access them now in the Download Files box on your screen. If you have any trouble accessing the document, please let us know in the chat. In the materials, you'll find some tools such as a checklist and guiding questions, and these tools will help you create a presentation that is tailored for maximum impact. I'm now going to turn it over to Jill, who will talk about the importance of considering the audience, drawing on the things she's learned during her time as a professional development presenter.
Thanks, Dana. Okay, well, because you want your audience to value and use the information you're presenting, you have to start by considering who your audience is and what their interests and needs are. So I don't know if you've ever sat through a presentation and felt like the speaker really didn't understand your perspective, but when that happens, it can make you tune out or just want to dismiss everything the presenter says. So it's important to be prepared specifically for your audience as much as possible. You want to make sure your audience understands the research and is motivated by the findings. I'm going to take you through some steps to help you focus your audience so that you can achieve these goals. Okay, the first thing that you probably think about when preparing a presentation is the format or the structure of the event. What kind of space do you have to work with? If it's a boardroom or a conference room or an auditorium or if it's a webinar, all of that has an impact on how you can engage with your audience and how they can engage with each other. And then, of course, how many people will there be? For me, the breaking point is around 40 people. If there's more than 40 people, the way I structure the presentation is the same as if there are 100 or 200, just the limited interactions that are possible. And then you have to think about how much time you have, because that's probably the biggest determinant of what you can accomplish. And you may have to prioritize what you want to say to make sure that people have time to digest it and work with it. So the format of the event obviously guides your presentation and helps determine the best opportunities for interaction between you and your participants. After thinking about the format of the event, there are still other things to consider about your audience before drafting your presentation. We've put together a tool for you to use to think about how to approach your presentation based on who the audience will be. So if you can look in your workshop materials, there's a Considering Your Audience checklist on page 4. The checklist includes tips that will help you create a presentation that's tailored for maximum impact. You've probably thought about some of these things before, but the checklist is meant to give you a structured way to think about who will be there, who is missing, what's most relevant to them, how is the audience likely to react to what you have to say, what are the existing dynamics within the group that might make a difference, how can the audience use the research findings, and what are the next steps. So, for example, if you look at checklist item number 4, how is the audience likely to react? It's important to think about this ahead of time so that you can prepare for anything controversial that might come up and that you have a plan for how to handle it if it does. The checklist will also help you lay the groundwork for possible future work with this group. So I'm going to turn it back to Dana now, who's going to lead you through an activity about considering your audience.
Thank you, Jill. Oops, thanks. Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Sorry, hello. Let's practice using this checklist to prepare for a sample presentation. On page 8 of the workshop materials, you will see 5 different sample scenarios where a researcher might find herself presenting her research findings to different types of audiences. For now, we're going to look at scenario 1, which is a common situation. A researcher is making a presentation to a group of people who have convened for a workshop. So here's the scenario. A group of about 40 people from a single district have gathered to hear about your research, which is about the impact of student agency on student achievement. In this table, you'll see the different considerations that Jill spoke about. Who will be there, who will be missing, what is the most relevant, how the audience is likely to react, etc. For each consideration, you would begin by describing what the conditions are. Here are some ideas that we came up with. There's not necessarily one answer to these questions. You might have different ideas. For instance, in number 2, who is missing? We thought of parents. It's also the case that with the exception of teacher leaders, teachers will not be part of this conversation. In terms of what is most relevant, the audience will want to know why they should consider adding opportunities for student agency into their schools. Its impact on student achievement will be relevant. Looking at questions 4 and 5, they will have different levels of understanding, perhaps some skepticism, and there will be different levels of buy-in. Also, the different roles of the people in the room means that there will likely be different priorities and perspectives. And in addition, for number 6, in terms of how the audience can use the research findings, different people will have different ways in which they can increase student agency. Teacher leaders can potentially try it in the classroom, while administrators can offer support through training and professional development. Finally, we thought it would be useful to consider barriers to increasing student agency as a possible next step, although you might have other ideas as well. So now let's go to a quick poll. In this scenario, which consideration do you think would be the most difficult to address? You can choose your answer. Would it be who will be there, who will be missing, what is most relevant, how is the audience likely to react, what are the group dynamics, how can the audience use the research findings, or what are the next steps? So if you can take a moment and cast your vote for what you think would be the most difficult to address, that would be great. Just a few more moments, and then we'll discuss the poll. So which consideration do you think would be the most difficult to address of these? I know there's a lot of people who haven't voted yet, so please take the moment and cast your vote. There's no right answer here. All right, we're going to broadcast the results now. So there was no single consideration that people chose as the hardest to address. Group dynamics got the highest percent with 31%. How the audience can use the research findings was another consideration people thought was difficult, as was how the audience is likely to react. So let's return to the presentation now and talk about how we might address these considerations. So the right-hand column on this table is a place for you to collect your thoughts about how you might address the considerations that you have identified. Here are some examples of how we thought we could address some of these considerations. For number 3, what is the most relevant, we thought it could make sense to emphasize what has been learned by districts that are further along in their implementation. In terms of addressing the skepticism, number 4, we thought that it might make sense to acknowledge some of the limitations of student agency while also talking about the positive impacts. So these are the kinds of things you might want to incorporate into your presentation. And again, there's no one answer or solution. These are some ideas, and we would also love to hear your ideas as well. It would be great if people could use the chat to share your ideas about how to address these considerations. And especially the ones that people thought would be the most difficult, which was number 4, how the audience is likely to react, what are the group dynamics, and how the audience can use the research findings. So if you have ideas about how you would address those considerations, please share them. And again, I know we have a lot of people in today's workshop who have a lot of experience doing this as well. So please share your ideas. So looks like Gretchen is typing, thank you, as is Alex and Renee. Thank you so much. Please share your ideas. So Renee suggests that in a mixed group there are different levels of power and decision making regarding what a school may adopt, which could impact the conversation. Absolutely, absolutely. So what can you do knowing going into the presentation to try to manage that consideration? A lot of people are typing. So Gretchen has an idea about how to address number 4, specify what is known from research and where there are gaps in our understanding of student agency. Absolutely. It's a great suggestion, acknowledging that there are gaps while also being clear about what we know. Looks like a lot of people are typing, thank you. Katie, provide opportunities to respond to open-ended questions about experiences and current practices that could be more easily modified. Another great idea. So engaging with the audience and letting them air their questions so that they can get out on the table and can be addressed. Construct a map with the group to include different perspectives. That's another good idea. And you may have an individual who dominates the discussion, so it may be helpful to say things such as, what do you think so-and-so, to try to redirect to other people, which is another idea. We had talked about setting ground rules so that everybody gets a chance to share their views, but there's a variety of ways that you can handle it, try to handle and manage the group dynamics. These are really good points. So strategies for flattening the power structure may be helpful. These may include randomly forming small group discussions to mix senior and junior staff, capturing and addressing comments from all participants regardless of their position. Yep. Also, another good idea. This is great. And I see that a lot of people are still typing. We'll take a few more comments and then we'll keep moving. So with number 6, it would be key to have the audience reflect on how they see student agency fitting in their current practice, in addition to sharing what current research says about student agency in education. Right. So again, another way to engage the audience and to hear what they think and sort of have them be part of the conversation. This is great. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for sharing your ideas. It's really helpful. I think we there's some sort of common themes that came out in the conversation about managing the dynamics, sort of figuring out ways to sort of address the difference in power among the people in the room, giving everybody a chance to participate, and also giving people a chance to share their opinion and be part of the conversation. This is really helpful. Thank you. So now we're going to move on to another scenario. This is scenario 2. It's very different. It's a very different example of how a researcher might present her work. In this scenario, a researcher will share mixed results with a funder who invested in the program. In this case, the foundation has an explicit agenda to increase social-emotional learning in schools, and your results are mixed about the impact of a new strategy. So needless to say, this can be a tricky situation. Given your audience, several things jump out as potentially being difficult. The fact that these are funders and their likely reactions. So for this scenario, we're going to focus on 2 considerations. Number 4, their likely reactions, and number 7, next step. So how is the audience likely to react? We thought that there could be dismay, that their investment in a new approach is not having the desired outcomes. And in terms of next steps, we thought there might be an opportunity to make a pitch for additional research. So now I would like to turn it back to you and hear your ideas for how you might address consideration number 4. What would you do? How would you address their dismay that the investment in a new approach is not having the desired outcomes? What would you do? So discuss the potential reasons for the negative impacts. That sounds like a good strategy. Find out what they've learned about implementation. So engaging them and also talking about why it might not have had the impact that they had hoped it would have. Share what we learned in the process about how to make changes in a timely manner. So trying to give some formative feedback. Other ideas that people have? Looks like some people are typing. Share the success stories along with reflection on the not so successful. Right, so the good and the bad. Describe the benefit of understanding what doesn't work as well as what does work. Also a great idea. Stakeholders may have insights about areas that were not considered, so maybe some of the limitations of what the study was. An implementation dip, change takes time. These are great ideas. Our idea, which it sounds similar to some of what has been suggested as well, is give audience members a chance to articulate what they had hypothesized or hoped to achieve and compare those ideas with actual findings to look for areas of overlap and to list what is surprising and why. So again, trying to look at sort of the good and the bad and sort of have a conversation about it. And we thought that this would also connect potentially to number 7, what are the next steps, where you might be able to make a pitch for additional research so that you could further knowledge and deepen the understanding of SEL. So there's a question from Denise about discuss the measure, so talk about the methodology. Was it appropriate? Were there some limitations of the research? Were we defining SEL in the same way the funders were? So really trying to unpack what you did and what you found in conversation with the funders. All really good suggestions. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for sharing your ideas and your expertise. So overall, when considering the audience, I think the main takeaway is that depending on the situation, the needs and dynamics of your audience can vary considerably. I mean, if you were presenting this research at a conference, you might think about it quite differently than sitting down with the funders in a conference room. So the needs and the dynamics of your audience can vary, and it's important to think about their needs and their interests as you as you prepare to present your findings. So now we're going to focus on developing a compelling storyline. In considering your audience, you're likely preparing for some type of presentation. As Jill mentioned earlier, it could be to a small audience, it could be to a large audience, it could be in person, it could be virtual, it could be 5 minutes, or it could be 45 minutes. But in any type of presentation, you want to think about developing a compelling storyline. And the key word here is story. You want to think about how to craft a story for your audience. If you turn to page 9 in your workshop materials, we've developed some guiding questions to help you think through your presentation. These questions are closely linked to considering your audience, knowing who they are and what their interests are. And this will help you focus on what is relevant, interesting, and comprehensible to them. So first, and you can see these questions on page 10 in the workbook materials, first you want to think about what is the problem that the research addresses and why is the problem relevant, interesting, or important. You will need to focus your time. Often, researchers begin with their research questions, then proceed to talk about their methodology, their data collection, and analysis. Instead, we suggest that you lead with some of your findings, which is what practitioners and policymakers are interested in. Think about whether and how your findings connect to federal, state, or local policy, which will be of interest to them, and will also help make your work more relevant. As an example, researchers should be aware of state ESSA plans and how elements of those plans may intersect with their research. Second, in describing what you did and what you found, try to pique the interest of the audience. Make the findings relatable. Perhaps tell a story about a study participant, depending on the type of research you've done. Look to share an aha moment, and be sure your findings are comprehensible. This is particularly important if your findings include a lot of statistical terms. And third, be clear about how you would like the results of your research to be used, what the practical implications are, and the possible next steps. So thinking about the format of your presentation, who will be in your audience, and these guiding questions together will help you develop a compelling storyline. So now we're going to take a poll. Where do you see the most room for improvement in your current style of giving a presentation? Explaining why you did the research, explaining what you found, making the numbers resonate, or being clear about practical implications and next steps. Please take a moment and share where you think you have the most room for improvement. Few more moments, and then we will look at the results. So take a moment and share where you think you have the most room to improve your current style of giving a presentation. So let's broadcast the results now. So I see that most of you, the response where most of you saw the room for most improvement is being clear about practical implications and next steps, followed closely by making the numbers resonate, which I know can be tricky. So hopefully as we go through this next section, we'll be able to offer you some tips and food for thoughts about how you can address some of these issues. So we'll go back to the presentation. So we're going to put these ideas into action using a fictionalized research study. If you turn to page 12 in your workbook materials, you will see the fictionalized research study abstract. We have it here on the slide. I know it's small, so you might want to look at your materials if you have them handy. But this abstract is a fictionalized version of an actual abstract from an academic journal. I'm going to pause for a moment to give you time to quickly review it, and then we'll reconvene. So let's take a poll about this abstract. How much of this abstract do you think a general audience is likely to understand? None of it, some of it, most of it, or all of it? What do you think in terms of a general audience and their ability to understand this abstract? Okay, we have a winner. We're going to broadcast the results. So 82% think that a general audience would understand only some of this abstract. 11% thought a general audience would understand none of it. And 7% thought most of it. But clearly most of you think a general audience would understand some of this abstract. So clearly this abstract was written for a research audience, and it's appropriate for that audience. It answers questions about the purpose of the research, the methodology, the type of analysis, and the findings. But this is not an effective way to communicate with a broader audience. So in this next section, we're going to break down the information from this abstract and put it back together so that the information is appropriate for a broader audience, and we're going to use our guiding questions to help us do this. So you have already considered the details about who this audience is when we went through the Consider Your Audience checklist for Scenario 1. Remember, this is a group of about 40 people in different roles and at different levels from a single district who come together to hear your presentation about the impact of student agency on student achievement. So the first guiding question asks, why does the research need to be done, and sort of what is the problem? So here are some of the ideas we came up with. Concerns about increasing student achievement. Limited but preliminary research suggests student agency can help increase student achievement. And we want to be clear why the audience should care about student agency. So from these notes, we created this slide. And this is an example of a slide that answers the question about why the research needs to be done. Why do we care about student agency? Supporting students to develop agency helps them become ready for college and careers. Students who have agency are more likely to persist through post-secondary education. Student agency has the potential to improve student achievement. And this research examines how student agency relates to student achievement, what type of student agency, and for which student groups. So this slide sets the stage for why student agency is important and connects the topic to the state and district's priorities. It also pulls out some key points and phrases them in a way that will hopefully pique the audience's interest. This is one example of how to ensure that the audience has a clear understanding about why this research is important and what is at stake with this study. So now moving on to the second guiding question, which is focused on sharing your findings with a brief description of your methodology. So you want to explain your findings and methodology in a way that's accessible for a broader audience. So here are some of our ideas for doing that. Break down the different parts of the finding, describe limitations, clearly distinguish between reading and math and different types of agency, and provide vignettes if possible to humanize the research. In addition, because this study is not causal, we can't say student agency causes increases in student achievement. Instead, the research should only be used to explore patterns and relationships in the data, and it can suggest areas for future study. So in this slide and the next few slides, we want to highlight the main findings. So we decided to break up our findings to first emphasize that student agency does matter, and also the type of student agency matters. But only one type, student choice in mode of learning, is associated with increases in reading achievement. So we want to make the point to stakeholders that if you're thinking about opportunities for increasing student agency in your district or school, this research suggests that you will get the most benefit from looking at how you can give students increased agency in their choice of learning. In this second slide of key findings, we want to highlight the fact that the research found differences between high and low income students. Higher income students were more likely to take advantage of student agency opportunities, and the achievement gains were larger. So depending on the nature of your research, this might be a great place for a vignette or a personal story that could help drive this point home. Do you have any stories about how student agency contributed to changing the trajectory of a student's achievement? And then in this third and sort of final slide about the findings, we have a simple chart to highlight the differences between the different types of student agency and between math and reading achievement. Right away, we want the audience to be able to distinguish between reading and math and the different types of student agency. We want the audience to notice that one type of student agency, how students learn, has the largest impact. And again, depending on your time, depending on your audience, you might want to discuss the meaning of statistical significance, and here might be a place to also talk about some of the limitations of the study. There are, as I'm sure many of you know, many resources on data visualization, Stephanie Evergreen, Edward Tufte, and many others who can help you think about how to present your data visually. Moving to our third guiding question, what are the practical implications of this research and/or the next steps? Here are some ideas that we thought of. An important implication is that student agency seems to be associated with improved student achievement. We want to make sure to emphasize what the people in the room can do to promote student agency. We think it would be helpful to include a discussion about what barriers need to be overcome, and also to talk about additional research that could be done to replicate or confirm these findings. So we put those ideas together into this slide. There are a number of practical implications and next steps that follow from the research, and the first big takeaway is that student agency is associated with improved student achievement. And this is the hypothesis that motivated the research, and the findings show its potential. But there have to be opportunities for student agency in schools, and students must take advantage of those opportunities. And this research also shows that low-income students are not getting the full benefits of student agency, and that finding should be unpacked and better understood. So for our audience of 40 people from a single district, we thought encouraging a conversation between audience members both about the opportunities and barriers to increasing student agency would work well as a way to get them involved in thinking about how to increase student agency within their district. So I know that we went through these steps really quickly. We have limited time with you today, so I know we went through them quickly and in an abbreviated way, but I hope that it gives you a framework to think about the ingredients you need to develop a compelling presentation that is tailored to your audience. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague Candice to talk about creating a culture of co-exploration.
Thanks so much, Dana. So now that we've covered considering your audience when planning your presentation, we're going to turn to talking about how to create what we are calling a culture of co-exploration when you're actually giving the research presentation. This strategy could be useful when you have participants physically in front of you, perhaps during a meeting or a conference. In the next section, we're going to consider how to invite participants into making meaning of what they're hearing as opposed to just being passive listeners. So there are many ways that researchers can engage practitioners in research. Goodman and Thompson wrote an overview of different forms of practitioner or stakeholder involvement, and they described these three basic levels. At the lowest level of involvement, researchers can do outreach and education and make an effort to send information to the stakeholders to help them learn more about a study. At the middle level, there is coordination. This is when the researcher invites stakeholders to give feedback on research and to weigh in about the implications. This is the level we're going to be spending the most time discussing in this section. At the highest level of involvement, there is something called cooperation. This is when researchers and practitioners really work together to determine research questions and make decisions about data analysis and interpretation. This kind of research is highly participatory and collaborative. This is beyond the scope of what we'll be covering here today, but it's important to know that many researchers take this stance. It's also important to note that these categories are not mutually exclusive. So researchers might partner differently with stakeholders at different points in the research process. For example, you might have a lot of stakeholder involvement when you determine your research questions, but then maybe less involvement as you begin the data analysis section. So what is a culture of co-exploration? This is what we are calling when both researchers and the audience are invited to discuss, question, and explore the findings and implications of research. This is done after the research has been completed and you really want to begin discussing it with your audience. This is really different from how researchers typically present work. Usually the culture of formal presentations positions the researcher as an expert, sharing what they know, and the audience's only role is to listen. In a culture of co-exploration, the audience is invited to join in the act of asking questions and making sense of what they are hearing. The researcher is able to take an inquiry stance about his or her study and position him or herself as a learner together with the audience. This might involve a few elements, such as establishing shared goals for the purposes of reviewing the research, encouraging the audience to ask questions, and inviting discussion about the research findings and implications. So for example, throughout this webinar, we've been gathering some of your input by asking you questions to solicit your expertise about how you have done this before. To set a tone of inquiry and collaboration during the presentation, you might use what we call discussion protocols, which are structured discussion activities, to help participants talk about what they are hearing in the research presentation or to generate implications. Some examples that we've used are the Think, Pair, Share discussion protocol, which is useful for a quick discussion. You basically have people think for a moment about their response, talk to a neighbor, and then you could ask them to share out with the group. Or a gallery walk, which is more useful for a larger group of people. If you have lots of data displays or artifacts that you want them to look at, they walk around and look at them in the room just like they were looking at an art gallery. A detailed handout with some of these suggested discussion protocols and ideas is in your workshop materials on page 13. We also would like to encourage you to really be clear about the purpose for the discussion, that you want people to use the findings, but rather than telling them how they're going to do that, you'll enable them to come to their own understandings and decisions. So we just want to take a moment in the chat and also think about and ask you, what other ideas do you have to support a culture of co-exploration when you are presenting your work? Go ahead and tell us some ideas and strategies that might have worked for you. What have you used with your audiences when you are physically in the same room and you want to get them to talk about or interact with the material? Names of protocols or descriptions of protocols are always useful. Also, don't forget to take a look at the workshop materials. There are some examples of these protocols that you can download, and they have the steps right in the workbook. So I have a response from Holly, similar to what you are doing, or Holly, similar to what we are doing, use of polls, sharing resources, engaging the audience, and drawing them into the topic. I think with this webinar format, we've been using the tools we have available. Obviously, that's the poll in the chat. When you have people in person, you can get them to talk to each other, get up and move around the room. Physical demos, that would be great, Diana. I'm not sure how we would make a physical demo of a research finding, but that's fantastic. I would love to see that. Alex, a jigsaw protocol. That's one of my favorites too, Alex. You can separate out the room and people can each read a piece of something and then you come back together. That's why it's called a jigsaw. Grace's idea, exploring or discussing a challenge presented in a scenario. Yep, that's also a good way to get people talking about something, but it's less abstract because you're giving them a scenario to talk about. And then, Ivana, that's a great opportunity, a great example, provide the audience an opportunity to share their expertise. Always a good question and gets people talking. How have you seen this in your work? And over in the other chat, we have some ideas, again, using Google Documents to collaborate. So having people all log into the same Google document, that's a shared document. You can put in ideas there. And then I also see using a scenario to relate to the intervention, very similar to Grace's idea. And maybe we'll just take one more and then move on. Diana, she says, it involves hands-on activities where students build projects and then bringing examples to the talk. That's nice, showing student work or student results in the presentation. And then Clay, when presenting mixed, null, or negative findings to our clients, we often ask them to tell us what the story is. What might we have seen? Why might we have seen those negative results based on how the intervention was implemented? So again, inviting the audience in is a key part of making meaning together. So we'll return to the main presentation now and just show you a couple more examples of how to do this. So we'll show you two versions of the same agenda that a presenter might use when they are presenting information in front of an audience. On the left, you'll notice this presentation agenda starts off with the researcher presenting the study in a very traditional format, walking through the research question, the methods, data analysis, findings, and implications, and then the practitioners in the audience just receive that information, and then they have a chance to discuss the questions or ask questions at the end. There's no discussion. In the revised format, there's a time for introductions, so I'll click over here, and there is a second agenda. In this revised format, there is more time for introductions because the presenter and the participants really kind of get to know one another, so it's not just a quick introduction of the presenter. The objective indicates that the participants will contribute to the discussion, and the researcher begins by telling that compelling story that Dana was just talking about. Why does this research need to be done? Really drawing the audience in. And then there's a collaborative discussion of the findings. Next, participants have an opportunity to generate some ideas for implications, and the presenter closes with asking practitioners to discuss how they intend to use these results in their work. Remember, these small changes will vary by your audience, and also they can do a lot to create a shift in mindset of the people who are there. So for example, in the scenario we had been describing, where you are a researcher presenting about student agency to that group of about 40 practitioners, you might engage them in an activity where they look at the findings for the study together. Maybe you choose the think, pair, share protocol because you think it will be good to break up those different power dynamics so that you don't have one voice speaking in the room, so you want people to talk to each other. They can talk about the findings individually, think about the findings individually, then share their results with a partner, and then the presenter can invite people to share out what they think with the larger group. So again, in your workshop materials on page 16, there are some examples of these agendas. So we want to, again, solicit some ideas from you and invite you in by asking a couple of true-false questions. So here's one statement that is about taking a co-learner stance. It says, the main purpose of taking a co-learner stance is to build buy-in from people who might use your research. Let us know if you think this is a true statement or a false statement, and tell us why you think so. The most important thing is that rationale. Why do you think this is true or false? Remember, there may not be agreement among the group, and there really is no right answer to this. We're just interested in what you think and using it to start a conversation. So why do we think that this is a true statement? So Juliana says that this is all about onus. So maybe Juliana, if you can tell me a little more what you're thinking there, that would be useful. Is the main purpose of taking a co-learner stance to build buy-in from people who might use your research? No wrong answers here. Tell us what you think. I think some people are typing but not ready to submit their responses. Let's see if we can get at least a couple up. Okay, so Renee thinks this is false because co-learning can broaden the perspectives of all, can address the needs rather than assuming what they are. So there's other purposes. It's not just building buy-in from the people using the research. It could be from the researcher perspective. Maybe your perspective gets broadened and you don't go in with assumptions. Yelin says that it is true because when people are involved in making a decision, they have incentive to make it work, so that makes sense too. Ivana says that it's true. It also is to broaden the conversation. And then Diana says it's true because it makes the research relevant to them. And then Katie thinks it's false, so it might be a common reason, but her purpose in taking a co-learner stance is to invite the stakeholders into the research and interpretation process. It might invite them in, and they should help drive the diffusion of the research. And then Tran also says it's false because co-learning is about learning together. So it's not just about getting buy-in from the learners, as we said before, or from your participants. So these are all really interesting questions. Of course, we can have a debate about this, but we're going to move on to the second true-false statement. So just hang on a moment. We have one more here for you to kind of play with. And this second statement says, taking a co-learner stance means there is no wrong interpretation of research findings. Do we think this is true or false, and why? Something a little bit interesting to think about. Does taking a co-learner stance mean there is no wrong interpretation of research findings? What do we think about that? So Regina says it is false. I always have an opportunity to be wrong, so there's a nice kind of humility about that there is always an opportunity to be wrong, and as a researcher, we want to acknowledge limitations ourselves. So Tran just says it's false. It can mean the wrong interpretation, and Diana, no, some conclusions are just plain wrong. So this is something I think where, as we were planning this content, we agree that this is false, that there really is there is opportunity for participants to interpret research findings incorrectly. And that is the role of the researcher, to be as accurate and as clear as possible, acknowledging the limitations, and also being careful about what you can claim and what you cannot claim from those findings. So that is something actually that we'll talk a little bit more about in session 2, about how to help people avoid these common pitfalls of making the wrong interpretation of session findings. So thanks for playing along with us in our true-false. I'm actually going to turn it back over to Dana to introduce some of our guest presenters from Vermont.
Thank you, Candice. Now we have an opportunity to hear from a researcher and a practitioner who have a lot of experience communicating with different audiences who are not researchers. I'm really excited to welcome Claire Irwin from REL Northeast and the Islands, and also Wendy Geller from the Vermont Agency of Education. Currently, Wendy is the Director of Analysis and Data Management at the Vermont Agency of Education, where she supervises a team of business analysts and statisticians to turn data into information for supporting empirically based practice and policy decision-making. She leads the analytic activities at the agency, as well as plans, develops, and manages data governance, data protocols, and procedures. Wendy is one of the key partners in REL NE's Vermont Universal Pre-K Research Partnership. Welcome, Wendy. And Claire is a Senior Research Associate at EDC and the REL NE lead for the Vermont Universal Pre-K Research Partnership. In this role, Claire works in close collaboration with education stakeholders in the state of Vermont to address questions related to implementation of their universal pre-kindergarten model. She also co-directs the Partnership for Early Education Research. Claire is passionate about conducting research in collaboration with practitioners and policymakers and ensuring the work conducted is relevant to the work they do and thus able to inform the decisions they make. Both Claire and Wendy, welcome Claire, and both Claire and Wendy have a wide range of experience working with stakeholders who are not researchers, and their experiences and advice will add a lot to today's discussion. So we have some questions for them related to what we've been talking about to learn about from their experiences communicating about research. So first question. What is your process for considering your audience before making a presentation about research findings or data? Claire, do you want to go first, and then we'll hear from Wendy?
Hi, sure, Dana, that sounds great. I think really my process, or just thinking about my main considerations, when I'm thinking about the audience, some folks, when you had done the poll earlier, had talked a lot about the dynamics of the group. And I think that's something that's so very important to keep in mind, and that's something in the work that I do that I definitely try to keep in mind. So what are their roles? How do they relate to each other? So what are the power dynamics of the group? They may wear different roles and different hats. You also may have folks who come from different audiences. So for example, in some of the work that I do with the Partnership for Early Education Research, we will have people in the room who come from early childhood education, and we'll have others who come from the K-12 realm. And some of the work we do is around, for example, English learners, where in early childhood they call them DLLs, or dual language learners, and English learners is K-12. It means very different things. So even just thinking about what's the language that I'm going to use with the audience, how might different audiences interpret the data and the information, and what might those group dynamics be, and how might that affect their interpretation and how they interact, or what they'll talk about when they're looking at the information.
Thanks. And Wendy, would you like to share your response?
Sure. Thank you so much, Dana. So I really appreciate that we are calling out how important it is to really be thinking about that audience before you are there at the front of the room. And I think I bring some kind of unique perspective to this in that I left academia to take this job, and at the time I really thought that I was very comfortable and effective at the front of a room, teaching or conferences or presentations or what have you. But what I realized is that this is a very different context. The applied environment is a pretty different animal, and so I definitely learned, arguably the hard way, that I have to be really thoughtful about the roles that the folks in my audience have, what is going to be most salient to them, and what is going to be most accessible. Because fundamentally, if what I'm trying to convey to them doesn't resonate and it isn't something that they can make sense of readily and easily, I'm going to lose them, and I'm going to lose the value of what I'm trying to convey.
That's helpful. Thank you. And Candice has also put in the chat, which I would just echo, if anyone has questions for Wendy or Claire, please put them in the chat. We're going to hopefully have some time at the end for audience questions, and if you have questions about anything that we've talked about today, feel free to put them in the chat. So question number 2, can you describe a presentation that was especially tricky, either because of the findings or the audience dynamics, and explain how you addressed the situation? So we'll start with Wendy and then hear from Claire.
Sure. The situation that came to mind most readily for me on this one was once when I was called to the legislature to testify on the evaluation plan that we were putting in place for our universal pre-K law. And I had been coached by my deputy secretary about, what language to be using and be mindful of these audience. And, these folks are not data folks. And by and large, most of these folks have very limited training and statistical methodology. So you have to be really conscious of your word use here. And I really thought that I was ready. I really thought I had it down. And what happened was I was asked a question about a variable that we had indeed thought about, but I hadn't gotten into the weeds on about how we were going to be measuring. And I kind of launched, because I had been thrown off my script, and I launched into, oh yes, that's no problem. That's a very simple yes, no flag. We can certainly add that to the model. And the whole room kind of glazed over. And I realized that I had done what my deputy secretary had said absolutely not to do. So quite honestly, I actually I used humor, and I met them where they were. So I essentially said, sorry, they don't let me out much, which is true, and it actually worked, and it diffused the tension in the room, and it allowed me to fall back on, yes, I hear your question. We are going to be addressing that question by accounting for factors like that in these ways. So it was about being able to adjust my language and having the humility to kind of laugh at my own mistake.
Thank you, Wendy. I think many of us can relate to that answer. Claire, do you have a response?
Well, first, I just want to say that's an amazing response. And I think it's so funny because humor is something that I try to infuse into all of my presentations, especially with practitioners, because I try to get them jazzed up about the opportunity to be looking at data. But that's a really great example, Wendy. I would say, for me, there was a time, so in the partnership work that I do in Connecticut, we had developed a survey, conducted the survey, but the response rate was really very low. And it was really our first effort to do primary data collection with this group of early childhood practitioners. And I think earlier, Dana, you were talking about the accessibility, the relevance, and the actionability of what we were showing. And it really was accessible and relevant, I think, but because of the low response rate, it really wasn't actionable. It was really more well, here's some information from these very few practitioners who participated in how these early childhood teachers are using assessments and assessment data. And interestingly, it really piqued their interest. They were really excited about it, but they wanted so much more out of the data than we could give them because it really was not generalizable. We were able to use it as a learning experience to say, listen, like this is part of the reason we need your backing. We need you to help support us in this work. If this work is relevant and interesting to you, we're going to need you to help us in these survey efforts. And I will say we just recently did another survey effort and we got a much better response rate even from parents, which was really exciting. So I think we were able to use that to kind of launch into additional and improve later work that we're doing together. But I'd say that would be my long-winded answer and example.
Thank you. It's also really helpful. So we're going to have one more question for Claire and Wendy. How have you used your audience to help you make sense of your findings? And Claire, do you want to start first with this question, and then we'll hear from Wendy?
Sure, absolutely. What I really like to do is to ask my audience really just for their reaction. I think it's helpful. Sometimes I don't want to make what I say about the findings color that, what they might say. So really just presenting the findings, helping to make sense of what the graphs mean if we're, for example, showing graphs, but then not interpreting them at all and asking them, what stands out to you? What resonates with you? Do you see anything that seems odd? Is something missing? So what else do you need to know about? If you look at this information, does it tell you, oh, wait, but this isn't really that helpful unless I know this? And does it relate to anything that they've looked at? So sometimes they've explored some of this stuff, or they may have explored it anecdotally and thought about it anecdotally, or they may have actually done some data collection on their own, and they can relate some of that to the findings that you're finding. So I really try to put it in their hands first to get their interpretation before kind of coloring it with my own.
Great, thank you. Wendy, do you have a response?
Sure, and I'll try to keep this brief. Sometimes I think one of the most helpful things that any audience that I am talking about data to is in this context for me has been knowing the story behind the data, like knowing where the collection came from or knowing how a program was implemented. It's kind of that qualitative context behind the quantitative information that has helped me in the past take a different look at what it is that I had set out to do or the questions that I thought to pose to the data themselves, and it has actually, in several instances, had me reorient my approach to the analysis entirely.
Great, thank you. And before I turn it over to Claire to talk about the Vermont Universal Pre-K Research Partnership, I want to just pose a question from Martha for Claire. What was the difference between the two surveys, and how did you get a better response from parents and teachers?
That's a great question, Martha. So I think one of the differences was the buy-in from our stakeholders at the higher level, so our who we consider our partners. The first survey really came out of, quite frankly, when we first wrote to getting a researcher-practitioner partnership grant from IES, Institute of Education Sciences. We had to come up with our own questions. And so we had come up with questions we thought would be valuable, but I think at that point our partners weren't necessarily as bought into the active primary data collection role that they might have to play. And since then, the second survey really came out of a co-creation of a research agenda, and I think that really helped because they really had that buy-in. I think that's probably the best answer I have for that one. It was really helpful to really get their buy-in.
Thank you, Claire. Now we just have a few minutes left. And we're going to turn to Claire to hear a bit about the Universal Pre-K Research Partnership, which is an example from when in Candice's remarks, what she called cooperation, where researchers and stakeholders conduct research jointly. Claire, I'll turn it over to you briefly.
Yes, thank you. I know we're running short on time, so I will be very brief. So the Vermont Universal Pre-K Research Partnership really came out of conversations that EDC had with the Deputy Secretary of Education during our process of the proposal for the new regional educational lab. And this is really at a time where Act 166, which is Vermont's universal pre-K legislation, was really getting started. And so it was something that's important for them to know is really around how is that being implemented and how might they change it. So the partnership itself does include both the Agency of Education and the Agency of Human Services, because currently they're both responsible for implementation of universal pre-K. And so I think that if you want to know more about that, I believe that Ashley and others have been posting links in the chat, but please feel free to reach out to me or I think you could probably Google search it and you might be able to find it. But I'm going to move the slide on to Wendy, because she's just going to touch really quickly on what it takes to get it done.
Sure. Thanks, Claire. So I'm just going to move through this very quickly. I know everybody is probably antsy for time. These are essentially the elements that we found that had the most importance for developing a strong relationship basically in any context. So commitment. In the midst of red tape, systemic institutional change, the need to have the commitment on both sides to keep the work in flight when working against any of these things is really critical. So one example of this is how long it took us to actually get the data sharing agreement or the Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, in place. It was well over a year. We had some, not just institutional change, but we had actually state governmental change. The governor had an executive order to create a centralized agency of digital services to centralize all IT services, and there was a lot of uncertainty about the current and historical practices surrounding data sharing and getting data sharing agreements in place. And so that has been some quite new waters for us to navigate. We do have it in place now, and work is underway. So that shared commitment has been critical. Having shared values, things like making the research accessible to the field, wanting to be able to inform policy and practice on the ground, have been absolutely integral in making this a successful partnership. We know that the push in academia is always to kind of publish or perish or what have you, but in an environment like this, you have to share the value of actually making the information intelligible to those practitioners on the ground and those practitioners in legislative circles or other stakeholders. Having respect, so respecting the time commitment that's required on both sides, making an effort to be at the table when scheduled, but also understanding the sometimes very difficult context within which any of our partners may be working. I know I myself have had to apologize profusely to Claire when my schedule got eaten up in time that I had initially set aside to be able to work on the partnership with her. Thank you, Claire, for all of your kindness and flexibility in an ongoing fashion, and also compromise. So sometimes what is the most desirable from a research standpoint might be completely and fundamentally beyond what the data can actually support, or the timeline might be outside of what would actually be useful to practice or policy. So finding ways to be able to provide high quality and easily digestible and useful research output. For example, descriptives can be very powerful, and they're often glazed over in research, but for practitioners or policymakers, these can actually be some of the most important and useful tools that can help them make important decisions. And so I would just, as a convert myself, who initially kind of coming out of academia thought, oh gosh, if I'm not going to approach this from a structural equation modeling standpoint, then what value am I kind of providing? And I didn't have a great appreciation for what descriptives actually bring to the table. They're very powerful, and we shouldn't just gloss over them. And so with that, I'm going to hand back over for any questions that there might be.
Thank you so much, Wendy and Claire. Just your remarks and your examples were incredibly helpful. Thank you. So I think we have answered our questions, both in chat and also the question for Claire. I'm going to now turn it back to Ashley for the final few minutes. Thank you all so much for taking the time to join us this afternoon. We hope you'll also join us for our second workshop in June as well.
Thanks, Dana. So this is Ashley Gaddis again, the REL Dissemination Manager. I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to ask you all to please complete our stakeholder feedback survey. When this webinar closes down, the online survey will automatically launch in your browser. So if you can just hang out for one more minute and complete that quick survey, that would be really helpful to us. I also want to remind everyone that this is the first session, so session 2 is on June 13th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, so put that on your calendar. We look forward to seeing most of you or all of you again on the 13th. Here is some contact information for our presenters. Feel free to reach out to the staff at REL Northeast Islands at any time or visit our website. And again, thank you for joining us. Today's workshop was recorded and will be archived and uploaded to the IES